Feudalism and the Church. Feudalism was the dominant social system in medieval Europe from the 9th to the 15th century. It was based on a hierarchical structure of mutual obligations between the king, the nobles, and the peasants. The king would grant land or a fief to a noble in exchange for military service. The noble would then grant a portion of that land to a vassal in exchange for loyalty and agricultural production. And the peasants who worked the land were obligated to pay rent and taxes to the noble in exchange for protection. However, this social hierarchy was not the only powerful force in medieval Europe. The other great power was the Roman Catholic Church. In fact, during the High Middle Ages, the Pope was second only to the king in terms of power. Now, you might be asking, why was the Church so powerful? Well, there are several reasons. First, the Church was a huge landowner, controlling about 1/3 of all the land in some areas of Europe. This gave them tremendous wealth and power. Second, the Church played a vital role in the lives of medieval Europeans. People went to church for sacraments such as baptism and communion, but they also turned to the church for help in everyday matters. Parish priests often acted as counselors, helping people with problems such as marriage disputes. And finally, the church had the support of the state. As we have seen, the relationship between the church and the state was generally positive during this period, especially under the rule of powerful popes like Gregory VII. So the church and the state supported each other's power and authority, but this symbiotic relationship would come under strain during the 12th century when church and state clashed over the issue of the Crusades. So what exactly were the Crusades? Well, it helps to understand the broader context. During the 11th and 12th centuries, European Christians began to feel a growing sense of hostility towards Jews and Muslims. Some Christians even blamed Jews for the death of Jesus Christ. Furthermore, there were economic motives behind the Crusades. Medieval European states were experiencing significant population growth, putting a strain on food supplies. Many Europeans hoped that the lands of the Middle East were rich and ripe for the taking. Finally, there was religious fervor. Leaders such as Pope Urban II saw the expansion of Christianity as God's will. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for a holy war against the Muslims in the Middle East. He promised the European Christians who participated in the war that they would receive a reward in both heaven and on earth. Thousands of Europeans answered the call and participated in the First Crusade, which successfully captured Jerusalem in 1099. However, these victories were short-lived. Over the next few decades, Christian leaders grew increasingly concerned about the military prowess of the Muslim leader Saladin. By 1187, Saladin had retaken Jerusalem and other Christian holy sites. This defeat prompted a new call for a crusade, the Third Crusade. This time, European leaders were more prepared. They assembled large armies and sought the assistance of powerful kings like Richard the Lionheart of England. But despite their best efforts, the Crusaders were defeated by Saladin. After a brief truce, the fighting continued for another half-century, until finally in 1291, the Mamluk Sultanate recaptured Acre, ending the Crusader states in the Middle East. Now you're probably thinking, why did the Crusaders lose? Well, there are a few reasons. First, the European armies were often disorganized and poorly equipped compared to the Muslim armies. Second, the Crusaders faced logistical problems. Rations were often scarce, and the hot climate of the Middle East made living conditions difficult. Third, many Crusaders were killed by disease. And finally, many Muslims fought bravely to defend their lands. It should also be noted that the Crusades were not only about fighting in the Middle East. In fact, at the same time that European Christians were marching on the Holy Land, other European Christians were attacking their own Orthodox Christian counterparts in the Byzantine Empire. And while most historians focus on the violence of the Crusades, it is important to remember that many European Christians simply wanted access to the holy sites in the Middle East and participated in pilgrimages there. Church-state conflict. Tensions between church and state would continue after the Crusades. In the 13th century, Pope Innocent III asserted papal supremacy over secular rulers with his famous decree. He also established the practice of papal elections in which the pope was elected by church officials rather than being appointed by the king. But perhaps the most consequential conflict between church and state took place in England in the 14th century. The conflict began in 1301 when King Edward I needed money. He decided to tax the clergy, which outraged Archbishop Robert when Edward attempted to collect the tax. Winchelsea responded by excommunicating him. Soon, the whole country was embroiled in civil war. Edward eventually triumphed, and the English nobles forced the archbishop to submit. However, this conflict demonstrated the immense power of the church. If the church chose to use its spiritual weapons against the king, he could be removed from power. Another conflict between the secular and religious authorities took place in France. Philip the Fair had long been suspicious of the Pope's power, and he was eager to assert royal supremacy within his realm. In 1302, Philip issued a series of decrees known as the Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges, which transferred the property of the French clergy to the crown and placed the clergy under royal control. Once again, this demonstrated the power of the state over the church. These conflicts ultimately demonstrate the complex relationship between the church and state during the High Middle Ages. While the two institutions generally cooperated, they would sometimes butt heads over issues such as taxation and supremacy. In the end, the state won out in England and France, but the church would ultimately triumph across much of Europe during the Reformation in the 16th century. Other aspects of medieval life. While feudalism and the church dominated medieval life, there were also other aspects of medieval life worth exploring. For example, in the following videos, we will look at medieval towns, which were centers of trade and commerce, and often home to a large number of different ethnic groups. We will also look at the Gothic cathedral, a beautiful architectural achievement of the High Middle Ages. And finally, we will explore medieval art and literature, including works by famous authors like Geoffrey Chaucer. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. Thanks for watching.